we might be letting some more people in as we go along. But this is the last subject-specific subject pedagogy meeting for learning coaches this year. And it has been a really fast year. There's been quite a lot of changes. We've obviously had Tier 1 training. We've had development of the ITAPs. So there's been quite a lot of developments, and we're trying to streamline things a little bit for next year. So we will make a start. We're all together for this bit, and I did send out the links. We have checked that they're all working. So they went out today for the second part of this meeting. So it will pop up at 4:15, if it well before that actually, to ask you to attend, but you can leave that and attend once this bit's finished. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the ITT ECF and think about your role as a learning coach. I want to talk briefly to you about the ITAP practicable strategies and active ingredients. And then what we're going to really focus on is the 5-step post-lesson dialogue document that we sent out earlier in the year. And then we will spend the second part of the meeting looking at specific deliberate practice. So in the spring, we did, before that as well, draw your attention to the importance of knowing the initial teach training and early career framework. It was published January last year. It's actually become compliance that we cover all of it from this September, although we have been using it and making sure we've been covering it 12 months earlier than its actual implementation. As you'll know, if you've read the document and you've used it, there are learn that statements on the left hand side, which is the things that we're actually teaching in the centre-based training, and that you're teaching as well when you're doing some of your weekly meetings and looking at the information that we provided in those weekly meeting booklets. We talk about the learning coach being the bridge between the theory of pedagogy and then the actual practice in the classroom, and that link is so important for us. Something you'll know from the Tier 1 training, we did quite a lot about that. So really it's linking that learn that with the learn how to. I know one learning coach that I worked with in science said that since she's read that document and assimilated it properly, it's really helped her understand what it is they need to actually be doing on a regular basis in the classroom. And it's also helped her to develop a more appropriate target setting. So that's what the learn how to statements are for, really. And so if you know what's in the ITT ECF, you can be really clear with making sure that you set appropriate stage appropriate targets. So in the first term, as you know, we focus on behaviour management and planning, pedagogy and subject knowledge. The second term, we look more at adaptive teaching and assessment. And then this term, we're looking at everything and trying to plug any gaps that they have in their practice. So that document is really useful. The other thing that we provided you with, which I sent out not so long ago, was the secondary ITAP practicable strategies and active ingredients. You'll find that on our online platform. Please make sure that you read it, because again, it's another way of linking what we're teaching them in our centre-based training to actual practice in the classroom. And obviously the intensive training and practice is intensive, and we do a lot of time practicing those things in a short burst. But also, if they haven't become habitual in their practice, we have to come back to those things and make sure this is a really useful resource to identify what elements of their practice that they might still not have formed into a habit. So that booklet is split into two different types of information, really. The first thing is what we call practicable strategies. So these are things that you can break down into micro sections. You can model and script and rehearse them, and they can practice them until they get them perfect. So that a classic example of that would be something like 3-2-1. So to gain attention of a class, that is a practicable strategy, but it's made up of elements like standing in a position where you're visible, modulating your voice, narrating the positive, and then using non-verbal cues to help get the 100% compliance. So that as a procedure, as a learning coach, you can really break that down and say, well, you're doing 3-2-1, but you're not doing this element of it. So you can teach them this as a procedure. So that's the practicable strategies, one example. The other example is what we use for the strategic use of assessment, ITAP. where we provided a sort of a diagram, a schematic with those different elements which are in the picture there. But we also have supportive like video clips as well. So again, if they're not doing a monitoring pathway the way they should be doing it, you can support them by perhaps getting them signposting to watch that video again or watch it with them. So these are ways to sort of support you in upskilling them. So that's the practicable strategies. Active ingredients are slightly different because there are some things that associate teachers need to do in the classroom that are not so procedural and not so easy to identify. Yes, you can do it effectively, or no, you can't. And we were looking quite closely at our second ITAP on explanations and modelling that we did quite early on in the course, and realised that actually to explain something and model something is actually multifaceted. It's really, really complicated to break that down into sort of separate elements. But we still have to do that because in order for them to give really high quality explanations, there's lots of things we'd like them to see happening in their practice. So when we teach them in the centre here, we talk about two elements to effective explanations. One is knowing your audience, and two is avoiding cognitively overloading them. And then you can see here there's some criteria, if you like, that make an excellent explanation. So we might be trying to develop them further from they're already giving good explanations, but they're not planning for misconceptions, or they might be giving examples when they're explaining a particular thing, but they might be not doing giving non-examples as well. So as a learning coach, we've tried to do this to help you break these larger concepts down into smaller chunks so that you can really focus on which elements they're doing and which that they're not. So that's the active ingredients section there. Does anybody have any questions at this point? If you want to put anything in the chat, if any of that doesn't make sense, I think essentially we're trying to signpost the support that we're providing you in trying to set appropriate targets and go through that process of deliberate practice. If anything does crop up, do put it in the chat and I'll try and address it as we go along. So the next thing to look at is the 5-step guide for the post-lesson dialogues. Now, our external examiners in today, she's at Prince Henry's and South Worcestershire ITT. Today, she's looking at our primary provision tomorrow, and she's looking at secondary on Thursday. Everybody that's working with her already knows about that. But one of the things we've introduced this year to support you really is to break down that post-lesson dialogue into more strategic sections, if you like, as a process to go through. So from the Tier 1 training, again, you'll have seen this. It's made a massive difference, I think, to the skill set of learning coaches in general, but also the impact that it's having on the associate teachers. So we're going to just break that down a little bit further today. The first thing is praise. One thing I would say in terms of being an old learning coach, or myself, or someone that's done like mentoring and coaching for quite a long time, is that I always got into the habit of asking associate teachers at the end of their lesson when I'd observed them, so how do you think it went? And you know, that might come across as nice and supportive and getting them to reflect on things, but actually what we found from a lot of research is that when you do that, they have an overwhelming desire to pick it apart and be very negative and identify all the things they did badly. And of course, that's something we want to achieve in the longer term, but really what we want to do is to frame that conversation so that they feel open to being coached and open to being developed. So it's really important that whether you're a newish coach or a more experienced one, that you, if you have that habit, to try to break that habit and pile loads of praise on them of all the things you thought went well, and big them up so that actually when you do start getting into the nitty-gritty of focusing on developments, they're more open to that. So the second and third step of the process is probe and focus, and I'm not going to do anything with that tonight, but I will signpost you if you think that's something that you, as a skill that you perhaps want to further develop. Our Teaching School Hub website has a newsletter called Mentoring Matters that comes out periodically. I can put the link in the chat that will take you straight to it, but that is something that maybe you do want to look at. There's an article in there that describes how to get better at those two things, and I'll have to put the link in the chat towards the end of this. Okay. So the bit to focus on really in this first part of the meeting is the next section, the rehearsal. And what we'll see with that is that some people's perceptions of rehearsal and deliberate practice is that it's role play and it's gimmicky. But actually, when you do it properly, it does really, really develop their practice. So I'm just going to try and pop the link to that in the chat for you. And what I'm going to ask you to do just for a couple of minutes is just have a quick read of pages 1 to 3 of this document. And then I'm going to try and give you a bit of an exemplar for it. So that's the deliberate practice guide. And I'll put in a moment just the previous link to that, the mentoring matters. So just take a few moments just to read that. Okay, if you've managed to read page 1 to 3, if you just really quick, just put a Y for yes in the chat, and then I'll move on when we're ready. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Right, we'll move forward then. So you'll see on that document, there's a breakdown of how to look at rehearsal or deliberate practice in a little bit more of a micro sort of detail. And obviously, I'm not going to read it out to you because you can see that for yourself there. But I do want to give you a sort of generic example of how I've had experience of using this really effectively before we actually developed the model. So I want to talk about an associate teacher who was a biologist at a school that will remain nameless. We're going to call him Kieran. He could gain the attention and hold the attention of a really boisterous year 10 class. When he was explaining a task, they would all listen to him. He could get them silent. His explanations were clear. Then when he set them off on the task, 2 or 3 hands would go up. He went up to ask them for help, or they went to ask for help. He went to each student in turn and tried to help them. He lost sight of the whole room and then became more and more students became off task as he wasn't noticing that they weren't on task, and the noise level of the class rose. He got annoyed. He couldn't understand why he had to keep stopping the class to reaffirm his expectations every few minutes. So that's the sort of situation. So in the probe part of the post-lesson dialogue, after we've done all the praise, we started asking questions. Do you think your instructions were clear enough? Yes, we decided they were. Were the students able to carry out the task? Was it appropriate for them? Could they access it? And we decided that yes, it was. Did they have a time limit to complete the task? He said no, but that was an easy fix because that's just a case of telling them how long they've got or putting a timer on the board. Then I said to him, well, when you went to speak to individual students, who were you looking at? And he said, well, I was looking at the student. So eventually Kieran realised that he needed to keep an eye on the whole class at all times, even if individuals needed help. So that was the sort of challenging goal, really, and focusing on how we're going to do it. So we broke down and modelled what that should look like. So I as a coach, stood at the front as if I was him, gave the instruction for what I wanted the class to do, finished by saying you have 5 minutes, started the timer on the board. Now, this is the bit that's pivotal that's coming up now. So then I went and sat on the side bench in the lab, I just actually sat on the table and just continually scanned the room. Then we pretended that a hand had gone up, and I said, yes, Aisha, I don't, and she said, oh, I don't know how to start the sentence. But I didn't move from that perch and just projected across the classroom and gave an example. I then checked in with the front row and said, you need to get started. You've only got 5 minutes. Someone else put their hand up. I said, okay, what's up, Jerry? What's the problem? He said, can you come and read what I've written? And I said, bring it over here to show me quickly. Stay on that perch. While I was reading Jerry's answer, I looked up every few seconds and called the name out of people that were not on task. So that was me kind of doing the break it down and modelling it into simple steps. Then we wrote a script together. So the things we wrote down were instructions, time limit, set the timer, move to your perch. And then if a hand goes up, there's 2 options. You address it across the classroom, or you get the student to come to you. And what if they do come to you, you still frequently look up from their work to address off-task behaviour. So that was our sort of procedure, if you like. That was our scripting bit, or our scripting and rehearsal. So then we went into the rehearse, feedback, and just and repeat. So he tried it. We got him to stand at the front and do all of that procedure. He forgot to tell them the time limit. So we stopped and started from the beginning and quite comfortable with stopping and correcting anything that they've missed in a procedure at the time, so that they do not get into bad habits of thinking it's okay to miss out these essential parts. So we stopped, tried again from the beginning. He did it that time, and then he moved and sat at the side on the bench. We then, myself and the learning coach, we acted as students, and we sat in the other corner of the room. We put our hands up to ask a question, and then Kieran had to decide whether to answer across the room from where he was sitting or invite one of us as a student to come to him. We did this for several student questions, so reflecting on which of the approaches, whether he addressed it across the classroom or whether he got the students to come to them, which was the most appropriate in which circumstance, depending on the question that was asked. So that gave him the opportunity to to talk about the procedure a bit more and reflect on it. Then we went to kind of increase the complexity of the task. So we discussed what would happen if, rather than just 2 hands up, what if 5 hands went up at the same time? What would he do in that situation? So does that signify there was a common problem that was emerging? And what would he do in that circumstance? In a 5-minute task, how many time checks would he give? What would he do to follow through with the students who he had to remind more than once to get on task? So we started off with a procedure. We demonstrated it, then we scripted it, then we rehearsed. and then we tried to, if that was working, we might have increased a bit of complexity. Finally, the stage was reflecting and implementing. So this is the important bit really that ties in with making practice become habitual. So the learning coach then spent the next 4 lessons observing that specific part of his practice. And if he wasn't doing some of the things that we talked about, she would prompt him in the moment. So if he ever left his perch or forgot to do a time check or didn't sanction students for multiple reminders to be off task, she would interject at that point and remind him. He emailed, this is a true story by the way, he emailed me to say that this has revolutionised his practice over a very short period of time. Just that simple action of going and sitting at the side and not losing sight of the whole class just transformed the management of his lessons. So choosing that lever is really important. Choosing that challenging goal is really important to get right. So that's just an example really I wanted to share with you of which there are many, and hopefully tonight in the second part of this meeting you'll be able to talk to other colleagues in your subject areas about maybe examples of where you've been through this process. But we've presented it tonight because we thought it was helpful as a more broken down part of that actual rehearsal process. So I hope you found it helpful, or will find it helpful, to think about it in these parts. You might choose with certain associate teachers to miss out the increased complexity bit. You might choose to spend more time on the rehearsal or repeat it more frequently, but that will depend on the quality of the associate teacher at that time, and obviously that will be different at different points in the year and with different people. So final thing really is we're about to end this part of the meeting, and we're hoping again that you'll have the chance to talk to your subject pedagogy lead about these examples of deliberate practice. But before we do, we're at the moment looking really carefully at how we communicate with all the stakeholders in the skit. And learning coaches are a really important part of that, ensuring that we make sure that you're really fully informed of procedures, but more importantly that you understand our curriculum really well, and if we're communicating with you in the right way. So we've put together a really short survey. It's got 11 questions, but only 5 of them are required, and they're all multiple choice questions. It basically asks you things like, do you read the weekly briefing every week? Now, it's anonymous on purpose, because actually, if we're not communicating with you in the right way, we need to know why that is, and we need to improve it from the point of view of the leadership of the skit. So please do be honest. So we do ask to identify your subject area, but other than that, it will probably take you just a couple of minutes. And then when you've done that, what you'll find is that the subject meetings should be open, and we'll let you in, and then they will do their bit. So I did that just 5 minutes over what I planned to do it in. But if I can ask you now just to take some time to fill in that form for me. When you've done it, you can sign out of this call and sign into the subject groups. But thank you again for all your time and support. It seems like this year's gone so fast, but to work with you all has been brilliant. Professional coaches have had the replacement requests for next year, and they're returning that by the first week back after half term. So they will, I'm sure, if they haven't already, approached you about either continuing the role next year or allocating it to some different personnel. But I think, Tom, you had a hand up? Oh, it's gone.
And it was accidental, sorry. I was going to do a love symbol to say thank you, buddy, but I put the raise hand instead. But while I'm talking, maths people, I'm sorry, I did send out a link as well. Please follow the link that Paul has sent, and I'll see you there.
Lovely. Okay. Yep. So sign out of the meeting as soon as you've completed the survey. And thank you ever so much for everything that you've done this year. Hi everybody. For the three of you that are still on the meeting, are you okay to sign out and then I will close it? Thank you.